In the early morning of April 4th, 1922, neighbors approached a remote farmstead in Bavaria, Germany. They hadn't seen the Gruber family in 4 days. The animals were making noise, desperate to be fed. But there was something strange. Smoke had been rising from the chimney every evening. Someone was inside. When they finally entered the house, they discovered one of the most disturbing crime scenes in German history. 6 people had been murdered with a pickaxe. But the truly horrifying part, the killer had stayed in the house for days after the murders, living among the bodies, feeding the animals, eating their food, and sleeping in their beds. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, a case so strange and terrifying that over 100 years later, it still haunts investigators and remains completely unsolved. Hinterkaifeck wasn't a town. It was a single farmstead, a remote property about 40 miles north of Munich in the Bavarian countryside. In 1922, it was home to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, owned the farm. He lived there with his wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. They were a typical farming family, working the land, keeping to themselves. The farm was isolated. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that screams wouldn't be heard. The forest surrounded the property on 3 sides. It was quiet, too quiet. And in the weeks leading up to March 31st, 1922, something was very, very wrong. It started with strange noises. Andreas told his neighbors he'd been hearing footsteps in the attic at night. He would lie awake listening to someone, or something, walking above his bedroom. When he investigated, he found nothing, but the sounds continued. Then came the footprints. A few days before the murders, Andreas discovered footprints in the fresh snow. They led from the edge of the forest straight to his house. He followed them carefully, studying the tracks. They were clear, distinct boot prints. Someone had walked from the woods to his farmstead. But here's what made his blood run cold. There were no footprints leading away. Someone had walked to his house and simply vanished. Andreas searched everywhere. The house, the barn, the outbuildings. Nothing. No one. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, watching from the shadows. He told his neighbors about it. They thought he was being paranoid. After all, who would hide on a farm in the middle of nowhere? 6 months earlier, the family's maid had quit suddenly. She told people the farmstead was haunted. She claimed to hear voices and footsteps when no one was there. The family had laughed it off. They needed help on the farm, so they advertised for a new maid. On March 31st, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She was 44 years old, a former servant looking for steady work. It was her first day. It would also be her last. That evening, sometime after dark, someone entered the barn where Andreas was working. The attacker came from behind, swinging a pickaxe, a mattock specifically, a farming tool with a sharp blade on one end and a pick on the other. Andreas was struck in the head. He fell but didn't die immediately. The killer struck again and again. Cecilia, his wife, had come to the barn looking for him. She was killed next. Then their daughter Victoria. Then 7-year-old Cecilia, who had followed her mother. The little girl was still alive when she fell. Medical examiners would later find that she had torn out clumps of her own hair, lying there in agony for hours before she finally died. The killer then walked the 40 yards from the barn to the house. Inside, 2-year-old Joseph was sleeping in his crib. The killer crushed his skull with the pickaxe. Then he went to the maid's room. Maria Baumgartner, who had been at the farm for less than 12 hours, was killed in her bed. 6 people dead, 4 in the barn, 2 in the house. And then the killer did something that would make this case legendary for its strangeness. He didn't leave. The neighbors noticed nothing unusual for days. Why would they? The farm was isolated. The Grubers kept to themselves. It wasn't odd not to see them for a few days. But there were signs that something was happening at Hinterkaifeck. Neighbors who lived within sight of the farm reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney on the evenings of April 1st and 2nd, days after the murders. Someone was lighting fires to keep warm. The livestock were making noise, but someone had been feeding them. The cows had been milked. The animals were cared for. Food was missing from the kitchen. Bread had been baked. Meals had been eaten. Someone was living in that house, moving through the rooms, cooking in the kitchen, sleeping in the beds, all while 6 bodies lay in the barn, and the house, some of them only feet away. For at least 3 days, possibly 4, the killer stayed at Hinterkaifeck. Why? What kind of person murders 6 people and then decides to stay, to eat their food, to sleep in their home? On April 4th, when young Kazilia didn't show up for school, the neighbors finally decided to investigate. When they arrived at the farm, everything seemed normal at first. Then they noticed the smell. They found the bodies in the barn first: Andreas, Kazilia Sr., Victoria, and young Kazilia, covered with hay and straw. Someone had tried to hide them. Then they found Joseph and Maria in the house. The police were called immediately, and what followed was an investigation that can only be described as catastrophically incompetent. The crime scene was not secured. Neighbors, investigators, and curious onlookers trampled through the property. Evidence was contaminated or destroyed. The murder weapon, the pickaxe, was found, but handled carelessly. But here's the most bizarre detail of the investigation. The heads of all 6 victims were removed from their bodies and sent to Munich for examination. The police wanted them analyzed by a clairvoyant, yes, a psychic, who claimed she could solve crimes by examining skulls. It didn't work. The clairvoyant found nothing, and then the skulls vanished, lost somewhere in transit or perhaps destroyed. To this day, no one knows what happened to them. The bodies were eventually buried, but without their heads. The investigation questioned over 100 people: neighbors, relatives, traveling workers, anyone who might have had contact with the family. And the more they investigated, the stranger things became. There were dark secrets at Hinterkaifeck. Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, had been declared killed in action during World War I in 1914. But his body was never found. Some people whispered that he might still be alive. Had he come back? Was he the one hiding in the attic, watching his family? Then there was the matter of young Joseph. Victoria's son was 2 years old, born in 1919, 5 years after her husband supposedly died. Who was the father? Investigators discovered something disturbing. There were rumors, never proven but persistent, that Andreas Gruber had been having an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria, that Joseph might have been his son. If true, it gave someone a motive: disgust, revenge, rage at what was happening in that house. But there were other theories too. Some believed it was a wandering vagrant who had been hiding on the property. The footprints in the snow, the noises in the attic. Perhaps someone homeless had been living there, stealing food, and when discovered had killed them all in a panic. Others pointed to a local man who had been seen near the farm and who had a criminal record, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. There were whispers of something darker. Some locals believed it was an occult killing, a ritual murder. The way the bodies were arranged, the fact that the killer stayed, it all seemed too deliberate, too strange to be a simple robbery or crime of passion. One investigator theorized that the killer knew the family well. The pickaxe was their own tool. The killer knew the layout of the house and barn. They knew how to care for the animals. They were comfortable enough to stay for days. But despite hundreds of leads, thousands of hours of investigation, and over 100 suspects, No one was ever charged with the Hinterkaifeck murders. The case eventually went cold. The farm itself was torn down in 1923, less than a year after the murders. The land was sold, the buildings demolished. Nothing remains today except a small memorial marker and the legend. Over 100 years later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in history. 6 people were killed with a pickaxe on a remote farm. Someone heard them coming, hid in their attic, watched them for days, and then murdered them all. And then stayed. That's what makes this case so uniquely terrifying. Not just the murders themselves, but what came after. The casual way the killer lived among the dead. The routine of feeding animals, cooking meals, lighting fires, all while bodies lay in the barn and bedrooms. What kind of person does that? Was it someone who felt entitled to the farm? Someone who had lived there before? Someone who simply had nowhere else to go? Or was it something more sinister? Someone who enjoyed it? Who wanted to experience what it was like to live in their house, eat their food, sleep in their beds, knowing what they'd done? The footprints in the snow remain unexplained. Who walked to that house and never walked away? Were they hiding inside when Andreas found the tracks? Or did they leave and come back later? The noises in the attic, the previous maid's terror. How long had someone been watching that family before they finally struck? And perhaps the most haunting question, when the neighbors saw smoke from the chimney on April 1st and 2nd, was the killer sitting by the fire, warming themselves, looking out at the darkness, knowing that just outside in the barn lay the bodies of the people they'd murdered? The truth died at Hinterkaifeck, along with 6 people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, 7-year-old Cecilia, who suffered for hours, 2-year-old Joseph, who never had a chance, and Maria Baumgartner, who had the terrible misfortune to arrive for her first day of work on the very day someone decided to kill everyone on that farm. They deserve to be remembered as people, not just victims in a famous mystery. But for over a century, they've been frozen in time, subjects of speculation, theories, and dark fascination. Somewhere buried in archives or lost to time might be the answer. A name in a police report, a detail that was overlooked, a confession that was never recorded. Or perhaps the truth died with the killer, whoever they were, decades ago. All that remains is the legend of Hinterkaifeck, the farm where someone walked to the house and never walked away, where footsteps echoed in the attic, where a killer lived among the dead, and where 6 people died and no one ever paid for it. This is the crime historian, preserving the stories that time forgot. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved after more than a century. Who do you think killed the Gruber family? Was it Victoria's husband returned from the war? A vagrant hiding in the attic? Someone else entirely? Let me know your theory in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing unsolved cases, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Next week, we'll be investigating another mystery that has haunted investigators for generations. Until then, remember, the past is never truly buried. I'm the crime historian, and I'll see you in the archives.